Hey, what's good? I know for a fact that this year's Super Bowl halftime show left a bunch of you wondering who the hell Kendrick Lamar is. In this video, we're going to take a look at all about how he's won all kinds of Grammys and music video awards and even a Pulitzer Prize. So we're going to get right into it. I'm going to keep working on texturing some of these models for this animation that I'm working on. Before we get into it, remember to go to coconutjustice.com and get you some clothes that I think would look good on you. Let's go. All right, Volksgeist. The link for the original video is going to be in the description of this video. So feel free to follow up. These guys have almost 500,000 subscribers, so it seems like they might know what they're talking about. And it's unfortunate that not more people know about Kendrick and all his beliefs and what he stands on. He's quite an impressive young man. Let's get into it.
Kendrick Lamar Duckworth, born June 17, 1987 to a working-class family in Compton, California, one of the most infamously poor and violent cities in the state. Kendrick Lamar, Pulitzer Prize winner, Grammy Award winner, the Coltrane of hip-hop.
Told you.
Millions of albums sold. We know who he is. He's the greatest rapper of our time. But how did he get there? As the story goes, it was 1984 and Kendrick Lamar's parents, Kenny Duckworth and Paula Olivier, found themselves in a tough situation. Kenny was running with the gangster disciples on the south side of Chicago, but Paula, his girlfriend, was afraid he was going to end up dead or in jail. She gave him an ultimatum. They could leave Chicago and look for a better life, or their relationship was over. So they took a train to California, bringing only 2 garbage bags full of clothes and $500 in cash. It took a while for the couple to
I'll have to tell you guys about how I did that. I moved to Miami with a duffel bag full of clothes and CDs, and I jumped on a Greyhound. Anyway, let's go.
Stable living situation. In the meantime, they worked fast food jobs, slept in their car, and sometimes stayed in motels or slept in the park if it was warm enough. It wasn't until 3 years of staying afloat in California that they had finally saved enough to get an apartment, but once they did, their first son Kendrick was born soon after. Kendrick Lamar mostly describes his childhood in Compton as stable inside but chaotic outside. His parents placed a heavy emphasis on education and a safe home environment. And Kendrick has talked about how they always made sure there was food at home and Christmas presents.
Many times have we talked about the importance
His mom
of
says Kendrick was always quiet
channel.
and observant to the point where the family started calling him Man as a reference to his maturity at such a young age. But Kendrick's childhood innocence didn't last long in a place like Compton. He talks about how his dad had a job at KFC, but he eventually realized that his work schedule wasn't adding up. Kendrick had figured out that his dad was secretly working in the streets to make ends meet for the family. His dad says, "I did what I had to do." While Kendrick tells positive stories of walking home...
Listen, there's a lot of people out here that you know that can relate. Boy, yeah. That's why it's important. We have to invest in education and helping people. So if you're not tired yet of hearing stories like this, I think you need to like get out of the way.
School with his mom, riding bikes, dancing in the living room while his parents listened to music with their friends. Compton was a dangerous place to be, and his parents couldn't protect him from everything. He tells the story of seeing a young man shot dead in front of his apartment building when he was 5, and how he and his dad accidentally got caught up in the Rodney King riots when he was 6, watching people loot stores and light buildings on fire from the window of their car driving by. There are many stories about Kendrick's youth, with the one constant being that all he did was write. Even in middle school, he was writing non-stop every day. His love of hip-hop ignited by the time he and his father saw Tupac.
And let me tell you something. There are people in the streets that respect people like that are bookheads, that want to make moves and make things better. There are some people that run the streets that I'm convinced, if given the opportunity to have done things a different way, all of that momentum, all of that potential that's making it's organized, if you redirect that potential to somewhere else, somewhere more constructive, if you take that potential and you feed it education and you feed it the possibilities of like doing programming and stuff like that, or running your own small business. We have to convince people that, and not even just convince them, but we have to actually hold up the possibilities of being able to actually do the American dream and be able to grow your own company without interruption. Like, some of you guys out here are just fucking dumb. And we have all this potential in the streets, but it's pointed in the wrong direction.
Dre filming a video outside of the Compton flea market. While Kendrick got good grades in high school, he was surrounded by what most people would consider a bad crowd. Like I mentioned earlier, his life was stable inside but chaotic outside. While Kendrick never went to jail or joined a gang, he found himself towing the line of crime more than once. Whether it was getting shot at, or taking a friend who had been shot to the hospital, or driving around Compton with guns in his car, it got to a point where his parents kicked him out of their house for a while. Although Kendrick was smart, focused, and motivated, even someone as naturally gifted as him couldn't completely avoid the trouble he was surrounded by. The pressure to give up his potential and lose himself in the noise of Compton was ever present. If it weren't for the people in Kendrick's life pushing him in the right direction, anything could have happened to him. From The Butterfly Effect.
And again, there's some people in the streets
by the time
that
Kendrick got to high school,
they see
his
this
career path
potential
was
and
set.
they
he was
and
going
they
to be a rapper,
they
and nothing
do
could
what
make
it
him veer
takes.
off
Like,
the course. One
those
day in
guys
particular,
aren't
Matt,
always
Jeezy,
bad.
and Kendrick were walking home from Centennial High School when the budding MC just couldn't stop rapping. He started coming up with rhymes off the top of his head, and he didn't stop until 4 or 5 blocks later when he and Jeezy were close to their respective homes. It was about 20 minutes worth of rapping, Jeezy recalls. At that moment, his friend knew that Kendrick had what it took to be a star. All he needed to do was stay away from the pitfalls of street life. In the words of Jeezy, I was like, damn, Kendrick, if you just stay out of jail and stay alive, you're gonna make it. The words that literally came out of my mouth were, don't go to jail and don't die. Sadly, prison and death beset many of their friends.
This is funny because I joke around about this all the time. I talk about how I am a unicorn because very similar to this. You survive the streets, and then it's not often that you can hear a story about someone not going to jail.
Later in the book, Moore writes, at age 16, he started running with the wrong crowd, partying and drinking alcohol. It was really just kid shit, the same thing teenagers had been doing for generations. But given Kendrick's neighborhood and family history, his behavior foreshadowed a possible life of crime and gang affiliation. Kenny, his dad, wasn't having it. He'd come too far to watch his son fall victim to the same habits. Kendrick says, my father said, I don't want you to be like me. This conflict that Kendrick experienced as a young man, this moral war between the violent streets outside and the talent and potential and goodness inside, this is the exact theme that Kendrick would channel into his musical storytelling as he became an adult and started to pursue a career as a rapper. This idea of the struggle to be a good person, the duality of man, and Compton as a living place, this is the story of Section 80 and Good Kid, Mad City. I think the funniest thing about Kendrick's early music, which a lot of people might not know, is actually the fact that he got signed in 2004, shortly after dropping his first ever mixtape at the age of 16. This mixtape that got him signed at such a young age, titled Young Neighbor in Charge, is really not that good. The cover art is just a picture of Kendrick with an email address and phone number for the label that produced it, holdies@yahoo.com, of course. The weird thing about this mixtape isn't actually the fact that Kendrick was a pretty good rapper even when he was still in high school, because look at him now, why wouldn't he be? The funny part to me is the way that he just calmly declares, what separates me from the other local young rappers? There is no separation because I'm not competing with them, I'm competing with their favorite rappers. And that prediction actually came true.
Listen.
Like, anyone can say that, but listening back to Kendrick predict his future into some tinny mic in Compton 18 years ago on top of an R&B beat, it's mind-blowing. Anyway, after some local success with his debut mixtape, Kendrick was signed as the first artist on Top Dog Entertainment by Anthony Tiffith, a record producer who had worked previously with rappers like The Game in the late 90s and early 2000s. And with his buzz steadily growing, Kendrick continued releasing mixtapes pretty much every year, opening for more established artists and working with label mates like J-Rock and Ab-Soul, but it wasn't until Kendrick got a massive co-sign from Lil Wayne back in 2009 that you could officially say he was on his way into the music industry.
Boss, we chillin'. What you
know.
K-Dot.
The homie K-Dot, he crazy too.
Yeah.
I co-signed the amp. Shout out to my homeboy J-Rock, tell my little nigga right there.
Nigga,
Was the homie, I'm telling you.
That sounds like most he's also very talented, multi-talented. He's an actor and a rapper, and now a podcaster, killing it.
I co-signed it.
Just a year later, in the fall of 2010, Kendrick would release Overly Dedicated, the project that most people would consider his big break and his first ever appearance on the Billboard charts, when the project peaked at 46 on the Heatseekers chart. Overly Dedicated is Kendrick's best and final mixtape, but if it were an album, it would probably be his worst. While Kendrick's rapping was pretty good, he hadn't yet developed the unique voices that make him the master of rapping he is today. And the mixtape's production and engineering, while pretty jazzy and dynamic, wasn't anywhere near the level his music would eventually reach. But I still really appreciate how he doesn't fall into the boring conscious rapper tactic of preaching about morality and simply rejecting the vice and sin around him, but instead, throughout Overly Dedicated, he portrays the good and bad of life in Compton in a much more artistic, human way. And in this way, Overly Dedicated is pretty much a prototype of the cinematic storytelling Kendrick would achieve on later albums, just not quite as polished or interesting. However, it is definitely worth a listen, especially since the project is available on streaming services. Section 80 was Kendrick's next release, and in my mind, it's a lot like a more developed version of Overly Dedicated. I think it's funny that if you go back and read old reviews and comments about this record, a lot of people didn't like Kendrick's voice when it first dropped. People complained about his high pitch,
People
which I
still
think is
complain
funny
about
because
that.
it's not something you'll ever hear anymore. The instrumentals on Section 80 are darker and more interesting, the mixing sounds cleaner, and of course, Kendrick's storytelling is on a whole other level. In my mind, Section 80 feels like a collection of campfire stories about Compton. It's not so much an analysis of social and political issues themselves, but a meditation on the way different vices and pitfalls can affect people in a much more personal way. You could connect all of these stories to political problems, but Kendrick is talking about it from less of a bird's eye view and more of a first-person perspective. Not as an aloof, disconnected commentator, but as someone who is
Definitely
surrounded
not
by the
a
people and
first-person
issues he's
shooter.
talking about. Growing up in Compton and centering the story of the project around the different ways life in Compton can be dark and light at the same time, he has seen the darkest parts of society, and that's what gives him the wisdom to explore these complex issues in his music without it sounding forced or corny. Section 80 is full of moving themes. Kendrick talks about drug addiction, prostitution, gang culture, but none of these issues show up through a theoretical lens. It's all very real and raw and approached through a gritty, first-hand perspective. My favorite song is the dark, jazzy Kush and Corinthians, in which Kendrick explores the record's ultimate question. He asks God if he can still be a good Christian and be worthy of heaven despite his human nature, the same human nature that allows for the darkness and sin discussed throughout the record. Section 80 is maybe kind of a
See, those are
rough
discussions people that read books have. That's why it's important. Like, you know, watching movies and watching videos and all that stuff, that's all fine and great, but you have to read books too, because what other people have put down as far as knowledge goes, you absorb that and you let that guide you through making decisions for yourself. And you can tell that his family really pushed education, because the topics of his songs are are topics that smart people talk about. This silliness about black and white and not letting people be themselves, that's what fucking dum-dums talk about. You got to read books so we can have better conversations, so we can have different conversations.
It's kind of raw, scattered, and unpolished, and Kendrick's later work approaches the same themes a little bit better, in my opinion. But I still think the way that Kendrick takes these struggles of his generation and demographic and speaks to them in an analytical way without it being corny, it's a very unique artistic ability, and even though it was his debut album, it put him miles ahead of his peers at the time and firmly on a track to stardom. If Section 80 was a manifesto about life in Compton, chronicling the atmosphere of the city and the spirit of the people living there, Good Kid, Mad City is an autobiography. Look at the album cover, a childhood photo of Kendrick with a baby bottle, a 40-ounce, and an uncle flashing a gang sign. In the words of Kendrick, that photo says so much about my life and about how I was raised in Compton and the things I've seen just through those innocent eyes.
I have
You don't
similar
see any
pictures,
other
not the
eyes,
gang
but you see
signs
my
part,
eyes are
but
innocent,
I have
trying
similar
to figure
pictures.
out what's going on. And
I'm
that is
holding
the
up like a
story of
bottle
the
of
album
booze and a
itself.
cigarette.
It's a story of growth on two levels. On one hand, it's full of tales from Kendrick's youth, painting a picture of how life in Compton shaped him and made him who he is during his teenage years, while at the same time connecting life experiences to more universal themes in a way that gives the record a timeless, literary quality, and in my opinion makes it one of the best albums of all time. The brilliancy of Good Kid, Mad City, in my opinion, is the fact that despite telling the story of an impoverished black kid growing up in Compton, a small city.
Real quick, this van is very important. So when you start to go down the rabbit hole of what was Kendrick Lamar and Drake, the battle that happened between those two, and you see some of Drake's videos, one of them has a van similar to this, and he takes it into a junkyard and crushes it down. If you haven't followed up on that rap battle and that beef between those two, oh my God, I can't. Please go do that. Go watch all those videos and then come back and leave comments in the comment. Like, let me know how cool that was. I mean, it got to be a little bit weird and a little, there was some boundaries crossed, I think, and at least some legal ones. But definitely worth the watch.
Los Angeles County, there's a universality to Kendrick's storytelling that makes the album not just a story of his youth, but it speaks to youth as a whole in the process of maturation that we all go through before becoming adults. Throughout the course of the record, Kendrick illustrates this process of growing up and maturing. In the beginning of the record, he's a distracted kid who takes a lot of risks and runs with the wrong crowd. He chases women, gets drunk, does drugs, and burglarizes homes with his friends. His character is on a path towards self-destruction, but the story of the record doesn't come to a head until the end of Swimming Pools, when one of Kendrick's friends, Dave, is killed, and Kendrick comes to the abrupt and sobering realization that he must change his ways or face severe consequences. The next song in the record, Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, is one of my favorite songs of all time. It's 12 minutes long, but I can listen to it over and over without getting bored. Kendrick explores the ways in which his rough upbringing made him obsessed with death, how his constant exposure to violence, abuse, and drugs at a young age gave him a dark, cynical outlook on life. My favorite lines are in the third verse, where he raps, cursing the life of 20 generations after his soul, exactly what would happen if I didn't continue rapping. He's comparing poverty to a curse, referencing the idea that a lack of education and financial stability can influence one's offspring for generations, creating a cycle of destitution. To me, that's what Good Kid, Mad City is all about. That's what makes it one of the best albums I've ever heard. By examining the cycle of poverty he was born into, looking at himself and his actions with clarity, he can not only change his cycle, but inspire others to do the same as well. Towards the end of the 12-minute song, he raps, what are we doing? Who are we fooling? Hell is hot, fire is proven, to burn for eternity, return of the student, that never learned how to live righteous, but how to shoot it, referencing the cycles of violence that perpetuate themselves in impoverished communities. At the end of the song, the outro depicts a neighbor, played by the legendary poet Maya Angelou, scolding Kendrick and his friends for
So you guys see the difference between this and like Sexy Red, right? there's very terrible things out there, very terrible rap music out there.
Guns and looking for revenge against the men that killed their friend Dave. She tells them that they are dying of thirst and must be saved by God in order to avoid further destruction before leading them through a prayer. Good Kid, Mad City is one of my favorite stories of all time. Not just one of my favorite albums or one of my favorite records, but one of my favorite stories. Kendrick's ability to make something so personal to his life experience that applies to the lives of so many people, and have it be so engaging at the same time, there is nothing else like it. Even though it's a concept album with deep structured narrative themes, every song stands on its own. But together, for me, it stands as one of the best stories I've ever heard in my life. Personally, it's my favorite coming-of-age story of all time, and I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. Good Kid, Mad City was nominated for Album of the Year at the 2014 Grammys, and it was named as one of the greatest albums of all time by Rolling Stone magazine, and was eventually certified 3 times platinum. And at this point in Kendrick's career, he had reached a point where people were starting to consider him one of the greatest rappers alive after just 2 albums. But his follow-up to Pimp a Butterfly couldn't have been more different. This is not a day in the life of a curious young man in Compton. This is a story told through metaphors that allude to events and ideas in a cerebral, psychedelic way that requires deep analysis. If Good Kid, Mad City's story is a Tarantino movie, To Pimp a Butterfly is a James Joyce novel. To Pimp a Butterfly deals with the transformation of thoughts and beliefs that Kendrick experienced after finding success with his music and leaving Compton for the first time. While he might be on top of the world with his music and fame, he's encountered yet more problems and tells this story with a broader, more political and analytical tone. There are few events that supposedly inspired the making of this record, from Kendrick visiting Nelson Mandela's jail cell in South Africa in 2014 to his outrage at the killings of unarmed black men that happened from 2013 to 2014 and led to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. He said it directly in interviews from this time period. He isn't speaking for the community, he is the community. Kendrick felt that he easily could have been Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown if he wasn't Kendrick Lamar, and he needed to channel that feeling into the album. He addresses violence, power, self-loathing, trauma, and politics in the way that...
Think about that. The fact that his family went from Chicago to Compton, that alone could have been enough to, well, it would have made him a completely different person. Whether or not he would have been Kendrick Lamar as we know him. Obviously not, because he would have been coming out of Chicago. It'd be interesting to follow that thread, though, to see if he did stay in Chicago, if it would have, influenced, if Kendrick Lamar would have been the rapper that he is today. You know, something as simple as where you were born just has, obviously it's a domino effect that you're going to be a completely different person. But it'd be interesting to to follow that timeline.
Those ideas connect to each other. At the same time, this album incorporates all of the different forms of black music in America. To Pimp a Butterfly incorporates the sounds of jazz, soul, and funk into modern hip-hop in a way that feels absolutely kaleidoscopic. And ultimately, To Pimp a Butterfly is hard to talk about, not because of the heavy themes and touchy topics, but because it's so deep. It's the same length as a feature film. It's full of obscure samples, references, and nuanced writing that you could literally write a book about. I mean, there are books about it in college classes too, and he really explores some truly depressing, dark topics in this album. The end result of all these thematic and musical ingredients is a psychedelic, dreamlike album that many people consider one of the best records ever made. The beautiful instrumentals were conjured up by some of the greatest instrumentalists alive today, and the deep writing is full of obscure references and both profoundly political observations and unfettered personal details. So just 3 albums in, and Kendrick has already made one of the best albums of all time. He's already revered as one of the sharpest, most talented cultural commentators in America, but I think the problem he was faced with now was that of accessibility. Yeah, To Pimp a Butterfly went platinum and debuted at #1 and was nominated for 7 Grammy Awards, but it wasn't all that accessible. And despite its meaning, there are scores of people who would never experience that meaning because they aren't going to invest the time it takes to dive into the album and appreciate it on its own terms. I mean, and I think that's the core purpose of Damn, Kendrick's 4th album, to continue exploring the themes of To Pimp a Butterfly in a way that has the
And think about this too. Think about this. Like, he's putting out these incredible albums in a time when an act might have one good song, and then they put out that one good song on an album with 10 songs. If you never had the opportunity to just chill with an album from back in the day, like the 60s and 70s, when they were actually telling you a complete story, this is a throwback to that. This is like music that actually has meaning.
An even bigger audience than ever before. If Kendrick's goal with Damn was to make himself absolutely unavoidable, to get so big that his concepts and message would be heard by exponentially more people than ever before, he succeeded. Damn ended up one of the most commercial albums of the 2010s. It was the first ever non-jazz or classical work to win a Pulitzer Prize for music, and it was the best-selling album of 2017. Where To Pimp a Butterfly was full of anachronistic musical inspirations coming from the history of jazz and soul, Damn was more inspired by the sound of pop, trap, and contemporary R&B. And when it came out, it was far more polarizing than anything Kendrick had made before. To put it simply, many people thought Damn was basic. After the overwhelming density of sounds and ideas on To Pimp a Butterfly, there were a large number of critics and fans that felt as if Kendrick was selling out when he dropped Damn. But truthfully, and I've mentioned this before, I feel as if no matter what direction Kendrick goes in musically, he's never traded a more accessible sound for less meaningful ideas. One of the strongest ideas on Damn is faith and the way that Kendrick struggles with his religious beliefs as a result of the increasingly stressful conditions around him. Once again, I would say Damn comes from
I can help him with that one. I can help him with that one. Bro, don't let anybody get in between you and your relationship with God. Don't let these Christians be ruining that relationship. Whatever you got going on right now, keep doing that. And don't let this earth make your faith waver. Nobody on this planet is that important. Nobody on this planet is that important. That's why I struggle with my faith too, but it's more because I'm, what would you say, disappointed in the Christians. There's some of you Christians are just out of control. Some of you that don't believe in Christ are out of control too. So I got you Christians, good ones. I will always, always stand up for the people that are trying to do the right thing.
But he isn't an evangelical leader preaching prosperity to the masses. He's here to shed light on the dark thoughts and feelings that a lot of people have without promising that things are magically going to improve overnight if you just pray. In fact, one of the biggest ideas that appears throughout Damn is the idea that faith may not actually be sufficient to sustain us, that we're losing our moral compass while hanging on to religion and ultimately not fully interacting with either. In the words of Rodney Carmichael for NPR, the Old Testament is full of prophets trying their damnedest to save the world. More often than not, their first obstacle they overcome is self-doubt, self-loathing, even their personal aversion to self-sacrifice. Moses the deliverer was a murderer with a speech impediment. Noah the ark builder was a documented drunk. Elijah the resurrector was straight up suicidal. All of them were broken vessels, but vessels for their God nonetheless. Then there was Jeremiah. He suffered depression so badly, likely from carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, that students of the Bible refer to him as the weeping prophet. Later in the article, Rodney Carmichael says, "Our image of prophets today is warped by history. Consider the realities they lived and the messages they espoused in ancient times. They did not bring hope and redemption. They preached apocalyptic visions full of fire and brimstone, meant to turn people away from ungodliness. They did not come to praise or worship, but to destroy and rebuild. With a sense of duty that compelled them to speak truth to power, they faced frequent persecution, imprisonment, and even death. Prophets rarely won popularity contests, at least not without being beheaded for it later." So in my opinion, the themes of Damn really shine when you compare the record's chief concern with the wrath of God and the consequences of sin with the absolute lack of such themes anywhere else in music today.
You can't necessarily judge an album this deep if you're a dumbass. Okay? Can we make that deal?
Spread political issues, his country's inner demons, so to speak, while at the same time addressing his own. His chief concerns are the eternal tug of wickedness and weakness on our souls. Kendrick depicts this conflict between wickedness and weakness in his own heart and connects that battle to the increasingly disconnected and polarized society where politics itself has become a battlefield. Damn was a pretty controversial album, but it was also by far Kendrick's most commercially successful record, with a world tour that grossed $62 million and lasted over a year, with billions of views on music videos and even more billions of streams. To put it briefly, Damn was undeniably a massive success, and while a few people thought it was shallow or boring compared to the depth and detail of Kendrick's previous work, in my mind, it's just as brilliant as anything else he's ever made. It just sounds more accessible. Kendrick's storytelling just keeps getting better and better, no matter what sound he's going for. Making 3 of the most successful and beloved hip-hop albums ever back-to-back is a monumental achievement, but it also creates pressure. So while I don't think anyone expected Kendrick to disappear for 5 years, it isn't that much of a surprise to me that he would take time away from the public eye to plan his next move. But it also only makes sense that the last thing Kendrick did before his hiatus, after the billions of streams and Skrillex remixes, was the soundtrack album for a Marvel movie. And the Black Panther soundtrack, despite being one of the better movie albums I've heard and spawning a bunch of major hit songs, is still a movie album, and if you were to skip any Kendrick-affiliated project, this would be the one. But I do think Pray For Me with The Weeknd is a good example of just how
let him go get his money. Let him go get that Marvel money.
Poppy song, Kendrick still finds a way to address the heavy topics he does in his own music. He says, "I fight the world, I fight you, I fight myself. I fight God, just tell me how many burdens left. I fight pain and hurricanes, today I wept." Kendrick didn't announce his disappearance or anything. He just stopped making music unannounced. And over time, while Kendrick was gone from the public eye, the social issues he talked about on his albums only became more and more apparent to the general public. Kendrick's music had become so topical and relevant that he was basically being hailed as a larger-than-life figure, a prophet, a poet, even a philosopher. I remember in the summer of 2020 when people were marching in the street against police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Kendrick's music was being played off Bluetooth speakers in the streets every single day, and there was this expectation that after everything he had said in his music, after all of his political statements and ideological concepts, he would come back and say something to make sense of the violence and panic, but he didn't. The only thing I remember seeing was some unconfirmed photos of Kendrick in a mask at a protest in Compton, but he didn't say anything himself, even though he was basically the unofficial muse of the Black Lives Matter movement. So 5 years go by since Kendrick's last album, and people started to get pretty impatient. We knew he wasn't gone forever. He had made an understated announcement of a new venture back in 2020 called PG Lang, a multilingual artist-friendly service company focusing on music, film, television, books, and podcasts. And a year later, in the summer of 2021, he announced that his next album would be his last with TDE, the label he had been signed to since he was 16 years old. But he didn't actually say when that album would be coming. He wrote a quick note to his audience saying, "Thank you for keeping me in your thoughts. I prayed for you all, and I'll see you soon enough." After that note, there was nothing about an album, even though he hopped on his cousin Baby Keem's album for a few verses, including the extremely popular Family Ties, where he pulled off one of my favorite verses in all of 2021. Fast forward to 2022, and once again, people are asking where the hell is Kendrick Lamar, and there would be no answer until a third of the way through the year, when he lit Twitter on fire by replying to a tweet jokingly saying Kendrick Lamar has officially retired, with a link to a note that said for immediate release, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, 5/13/22. Appreciate your patience. It was a frenzy, the most anticipated album of the last 5 years, an album that some people thought was
Ooh,
never
there's so
coming
many good
out.
music
Finally,
videos
it
off
was
this
right
album
around
too.
the corner. But at this point, the only thought in my mind was, you know what, some people are going to hate it. No matter what it sounds like or how good it is, some people just won't like it. Unfortunately, I ended up being right. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers was not a flop, but it wasn't what people expected. I mean, in my mind, this album is a masterpiece. It plays out like a therapy session where Kendrick explores the most vulnerable topics and stories he's ever touched on with his music. He talks about his family, his kids and wife, his mother, father, uncles, and aunts. He talks about his role as a protector and the people that protected him when he was younger. He talks about salvation and the journey towards forgiveness and the acceptance of trauma, and he even opens up about some of the trauma he went through as a younger person. He talks about his own duality, reckoning with his capability to be both good and evil at the same time. The main theme of the album isn't a new one for Kendrick.
Yeah.
He talks about the
There's
generational
good people
curse
in the
and the way
streets.
the actions of our ancestors can follow us through our own lives and create a perpetual cycle of suffering. Just because something doesn't have as much pop appeal doesn't mean it isn't meaningful. In fact, I think Mr. Morale is his deepest album yet. Over the course of the record, Kendrick seeks to free himself from the mental prisons and burdens put in place by the trauma he's experienced. And by the end, after some truly dark songs and ethereal production, he reaches a beautiful conclusion. He says, "I choose me, I'm sorry," referring to the idea that he can no longer be a cultural savior without first addressing his own family problems and inner struggles. Mr. Morale is a singularly beautiful, deeply self-aware album with some of the best songwriting I've ever heard, and in my opinion, it's a top album from Kendrick. Kendrick Lamar is a true artist, an artist who says true things.
And that
Maybe
music
sounds
video
simple,
was
but
super. That music video was super simple, but super powerful. It's just him looking in the camera. No, nothing. It's just like a white background, I think I remember it was. And his face changes into different people's faces. It was pretty wild, especially when it came out. It's the seamlessness of it was incredible.
live in a world where truth is far from encouraged in the art economy. You can fake your backstory, you can fake your culture and fake your personality, and you can be perfectly successful with that made-up persona, but you can only go so far with that. In order to get where Kendrick is today and make the music he's made, it takes a level of self-awareness and introspection that most people never reach. And at the same time, he creates deep worlds full of concepts and characters, and it makes every single one of his albums a masterpiece in its own unique way. Whether it's the gritty darkness and character-based storytelling of Section 80, or the cinematic narrative of a teenager navigating the dangers and temptations of life in Compton in Good Kid, Mad City, or the unprecedented musical depth and poetic format of To Pimp a Butterfly, or the massive commercial impact and themes of personal struggle on Damn, or the emotionally devastating depth of Mr. Morale, Kendrick has created a world of music just as imaginative, just as meaningful and timeless as any other great work of storytelling. To me, he's one of the greatest artists of all time, let alone in music, and his dedication to his craft is unrivaled.
Yeah.
Kendrick Lamar's greatest strength is not just how he can show us his truth, but how his truth applies to everyone who hears it. No one else comes close. This has been Volksgeist. Thank you for watching.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. That was great. And not for anything, but there is a lot of similarities between that timeline and my timeline. Holy cow. Whew. So that was Kendrick Lamar. And a perfect example of if you let an artist do what an artist is going to do, you know, you don't put financial restraints on them. You don't control them like corporate America does. Just let them make what it is that they're going to make, and then you let it go. And then you don't pimp that butterfly. You got to let people be creative. And wonderful things will come out of it. So there you go. That was the talent behind the halftime show at the Super Bowl this year. Kendrick Lamar. He's won awards all over the place, and his music, I welcome you to go on Spotify real quick and listen to this music. There's a lot of pain and a lot of things that you wouldn't even believe that come out of growing up like that. And yeah, we got a lot of movies that are coming out specifically on this channel that have to do with a lot of very similar stories like that. Anyway, as far as this video goes, I hope you liked it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, share it with each and every one of your friends. And if you want to come hang out with me and watch videos while I work on creative projects, hit that subscribe button and then change the little bell so it says all. That way, every time I come out with something new, you'll be alerted. Don't forget to go to coconutjustice.com and get you some dope gear. And with that, I'm out.
Coconut Justice.